Welcome, everybody. I'm H.V. Jagadish, professor of computer science. I'm the director of the Michigan Institute for Data Science. And I want to welcome all of you to our data science symposium for this year. Next slide, please. As you know, the kind of symposium we had hoped to have might have looked something like this. And these are some pictures from our event last year. But unfortunately, what we're going to have is something that looks more like this. But we've got a bunch of cool stuff that tries to make use of what this technology provides. And we hope that you'll find this fun and engaging and worthwhile event. Let me take a minute just to tell you a little bit about MIDAS. Next slide, please. So data science, as you know, takes theoretical foundations in mathematics and statistics, algorithms and computational techniques, and puts all of this together with a bunch of applications. Next slide, please. And as we do this, we have connected with people all across our university. And so MIDAS has about 350 affiliate faculty members from almost all the schools and colleges, not only on our Ann Arbor campus, but also from Dearborn and Flint. We have over 1,000 students, both undergraduate and graduate, who work with us and do data science projects and so on. We also support a community of over 100 staff data scientists from over 60 different departments across campus, helping them advance professionally and do their jobs better and give them a sense of community. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So I'm not going to walk you through the details of how much collaboration we engender. As you can see, there's a lot of interfaculty collaboration that MIDAS is supporting from the graph on the left. What I want to talk about for a minute is the picture on the right-hand side, the map of the US and a smaller map of the world. And we have been the front door for data science interactions with other institutions. Some of these are universities, many are other entities that are of relevance to our mission. And just showing you the big spread that we have. Next slide, please. So our mission is really in three parts: to strengthen our university's preeminence in data science, to catalyze the transformative use of data science and AI in a wide range of disciplines, and to achieve lasting social impact. And these three pieces really go together in what we do in research, education, and social impact. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our specific program of today. So I'd like to begin by thanking several sponsors. The symposium today and tomorrow is sponsored by Ann Arbor Spark, Domino's, and Microsoft. We also have additional external partners supporting us. That's Quicken Loans, the American Mathematical Society, General Dynamics, WACR, and the Environmental Protection Agency. we'll be saying more about some of these relationships and partnerships over the next couple of days. But right now, let's go on to the next slide, please. And I'd like to acknowledge the creativity and hard work of our program committee. They have put together what I think is a really amazing program under very unusual and difficult circumstances. I hope that you will feel that way too by the end of the day tomorrow. I'd like to turn this over now to Jing Liu, the managing director of MIDAS, who has chaired this committee of faculty. But before I do that, I'd like to go on to the next slide, please, and acknowledge the staff at MIDAS under the leadership of Jing, who have really worked very hard to get this fantastic program together. I would like to actually give them a round of applause and hand it over to Jing. So thank you very much. Jing.
Yeah, okay. So I also want to say to one of our staff members, Harrison, happy birthday. Before we go into this morning's program, I want to just mention a few reminders. The first thing that I like to remind everybody is that the online symposium is challenging for various reasons. So throughout these 2 days, if there are glitches in technology, in network connection, if someone misspeaks, please let's all be patient, tolerant, and understanding. For this morning, we will stay in this main room for the keynotes and for the research talks. Right after the research talks, there will be a networking session for people to ask questions to this morning's speakers. The networking sessions platform is actually easy to use. The link is on the symposium website in the email reminder that you received from us and will be put in chat later this morning. When you click through, you'll enter this conference hall and you can see exactly who's at what table, and you can join a table by double clicking. Now I'd like to pass the mic to Libby Hemphill, who is a member of the Symposium Program Committee and Associate Professor in the School of Information and Institute for Social Research. Libby will introduce this morning's keynote speakers.
Good morning. I am so thrilled to introduce our first keynote speakers. They are Lauren Klein and Catherine Dignazio. And Lauren is an associate professor in the departments of English and Quantitative Theory and Methods at Emory, where she also directs the Digital Humanities Lab. Her work sits at the intersection of digital humanities, data science, early American literature, and she focuses on issues of race and gender. She was named in 2017 one of the rising stars in digital humanities by Inside Higher Ed. And in addition to Data Feminism, the book that is the seed for the talk today, she's the author of An Archive of Taste, Race and Eating in the Early United States, and is working on a new project, Data by Design, which was recently funded by an NEH Mellon Fellowship for Digital Publication. Catherine is a hacker mama, a scholar, an artist, designer who focuses on feminist technology, data literacy, and civic engagement. She has run women's health hackathons, designed global news recommendation systems, created talking and tweeting water quality sculptures, and led walking data visualizations to envision the future of sea level rise. Data Feminism, the book that they'll be talking about today, charts a course for a more ethical and empowering data science practice. And she is an assistant professor in urban science and planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, where she also directs the Data Plus Feminism Lab. A quick note about Q&A, we're gonna let Lauren and Catherine speak for 45 minutes, and then Angela Shopka-Gonzalez and I will be monitoring the chat and Q&A, and we'll pose questions to them at the end. If your question doesn't get answered or asked, don't worry. As Jing said, there's a time to network with the speakers later today. So please hold your questions till the end, but you can put them in chat or Q&A anytime. I'm super excited to have you here. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Libby. Thanks for that warm introduction. Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. It's a true honor. I'm partially a Michigander, so although I don't want to say it really, but I lived in East Lansing, which is where MSU is, and not near University of Michigan, but I went to high school there. But like great affection for Michigan. And it's wonderful to see such an incredible just a wonderful, incredible data science initiative that's so truly interdisciplinary and really drawing from so many people across the spectrum. So that is wonderful. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. So I don't think we need any further introduction, but just to say that we're so happy to be here. One thing to note is that Data Feminism, the book, you can buy it and it's a beautiful book to own, but you can also just read it for free. And we have the link here. If you go to datafeminism.io, there's a link that says read now, and that'll just take you right to the website for the book because it's open access. What we're going to do today is we wanted to present a little bit of our motivation for writing the book and sort of the feminism that the book is grounded in, and then show you some of the examples that come out of the book. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Lauren.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to echo Catherine in saying thank you so much for being here on this early morning. Fun fact about Michigan, although also rooted in Accursed East Lansing, is that my partner and Catherine went to high school together, although we did not know this when we started working together in a professional capacity. But it turns out that Michigan is the center of the universe as far as data feminism is concerned.
Yeah, and I knew him as Lauren's husband, but then we ended up connecting the dots and realized that we had gone on a double date together in high school, actually. So that's a very strange Michigan connection.
It was meant to be, meant to be. And I've spent many hours in Detroit Airport on the monorail. Okay, so we see data feminism sort of, as Catherine mentioned, as sort of part of this growing body of work that is holding corporate and government actors accountable for their sexist, racist, and classist data products. So you can think of face detection systems that can't see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote applicants that went to all women's schools, search algorithms that circulate negative stereotypes about Black girls. I mean, the list could go on, and it does go on. And actually, I just took some screenshots of some examples from the past month or so to sort of underscore the point. On the left, you see in this ExamSoft headline, this was the remote proctoring system used for the bar exam. But it turns out, like many face detection systems, it can't detect people with dark skin. And so this article happens to be about a woman who figured out that in order to not be flagged as cheating on the bar exam, she had to shine a really bright light on her face for the 48-hour period. You know, I mean, I guess you guys are in grad school, you're not in law school, but it's, you know, it's like a two-day, all day, incredibly stressful ordeal. She had to shine a bright light on her face so that the system would not just flag her cheating and kick her out. And on the right, you see another sort of academic example, which was the predictive model that was developed in the UK to replace the exam scores that would have been provided by the end of year A-level exams that determine where you get to go to college, university. In the UK, they were canceled because of COVID. The government decided to predict what students' final grades would be. And as you might imagine, this went very badly. They not only took individual students' past performance into account, but they also brought in the past performance of the school that the students had attended. So if students were in historically underperforming schools, they found their grades just bumped down just by virtue of the fact of where they had gone to school. And the flip side is that if you went to a fancy school, you got a bump up. And so this is sort of a classic example of what Cathy O'Neil will call a weapon of math destruction, right? Something that takes existing bias and just amplifies it. Thankfully, actually, in both cases, student activism and social media sort of outreach resulted in a lot of attention being drawn to both of these systems. And at least in the case of the A-level scores, they were ultimately abandoned. And so the students actually were able to have their say. In any case, I bring up these examples in relation to all the books that you see on the bottom of the screen, only to say that, there's a long body of work that has been working on these issues for a very long time. And yet these problems keep on happening. And so if you sort of wanted our motivation in a nutshell, this is it, right? We know these systems are dangerous. We know that they are wielded without full attention to context and impact. And yet we keep on seeing them being implemented in the world and touching every part of our everyday lives. So I'm going to pass it back to Catherine.
So the fact that the examples do keep coming back is the motivation. And because also it contradicts in a sense what we were promised at the beginning of big data, which is that it would be sort of equally uplifting for everybody. There's all these kind of social promises made. And also a kind of a meme that got really publicized in the early 2010s, which you can see here on this slide, which is sort of touting, this was peak big data. This is right around, 2011, 2012, when The Economist magazine, sort of announced gloriously that data is the new oil in one of their issues of their magazine. And we call this a meme because this has actually been since picked up and circulated around the internet, primarily in sort of global corporate elite men circles. And you can actually go on YouTube and watch mashups of bunches of men saying this over and over again. And we think that this is an interesting meme from the standpoint of, first of all, they mean it in a good way. So they're making the analogy to oil in a positive sense. And then in fact, a lot of the metaphors that we are employing when we talk about oil and we talk about data are the same. So we're thinking about data, or the economist argument would be data is a natural resource that can be mined, that can be extracted, that can be cleaned, that can be processed, and ultimately that can be turned into profit. But just as oil had all these negative externalities, and we did not see an equal distribution of profit with the kind of oil industry, and we continue to not see that today. The same thing is happening with data. And in many ways, what inspired us to write the book is this wave of pushback that has been happening all along, really, but that has been amplified in the past 5 years in particular. And what folks are saying, and in particular, women of color, in particular, white women, in particular, indigenous people, immigrant communities, LGBTQ folks, is in fact, data is not the new oil. In fact, data isn't particularly doing anything for social good. What it in fact is doing when we look at it in aggregate is re-inscribing the same old oppression. And in fact, sort of exacerbating and accelerating that oppression in certain cases. And so here, the folks we cite at the bottom are some of the work among many others, but some of the pieces that have been most exciting for us in terms of thinking about what is this pushback to the data is the new oil meme. So what we contribute to this space is a focus on feminism, in particular intersectional feminism. So I'm going to pass to Lauren to talk about this image.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, feminism, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? Some good, some bad. There is just a really wide range of definitions. So we thought we would begin this talk by just doing a little bit of level setting about how we use the term in the book. And so we thought we would begin with Beyonce because that's a good place to start. So you see here an image from the 2014 MTV Music Awards. And this is when Beyonce, that's her in the front, she projected the word feminist behind her. And she was also singing about feminism in her song Flawless. That was the album that came out that year. And in the song, she samples a speech by the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is quoting what turns out to be the American Heritage Dictionary definition of the term. And I think Catherine has a slide with that on it.
So here's the definition. A feminist is someone who believes in equal rights for men and women and non-binary people. So mostly from Beyonce, mostly from the dictionary here. And so what we get from this definition is that feminism is first and foremost a belief in equality for all genders. But technically, we also get another definition from Merriam-Webster, because if you believe in equal rights for all genders, all you have to do is look around you, and folks that like data can go look at any data set by gender and see that those equal rights are not realized. And so feminism implies this commitment to action. So it's this organized activity on behalf of women's and non-binary people's rights and interests. And then thirdly, so it's belief, it's action. And then thirdly, and in a way, like most excitingly, feminism is a set of theories and ideas. It's an intellectual heritage. It's like a base of knowledge that we can look to and draw from as we face new problems in the world. And so this intellectual heritage begins by thinking through issues of inequality in relation to sex and gender. But the past 40 years of scholarship and our current political reality have brought many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation, including race, class, sexuality, ability, and so much more. And I'll pass back to you, Lauren.
So this view that brings together gender with race, with class, with ability, with all of these other issues brings us to this idea of intersectional feminism. And our view, and we say this in the book, is that feminism, if you're talking about feminism right now in the year 2020, it must be understood as intersectional. And so I think many of you at this point probably know that intersectionality is this term that was coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, which she uses to explain how social inequality cannot be explained by only one dimension of difference, like gender. When we're talking about inequality or oppression, we must be talking about the intersection. And she means this actually in a very sort of visual, literal way, like intersection of the many factors and forces that produce it. So the one thing I want to underscore about intersectionality, because I actually think this is a key point that is overlooked in sort of these casual invocations of the term, is that intersectionality doesn't just describe markers of individual identity, right? So, it doesn't just mean like, I am white, I am cisgender, I am a woman, I am, a tenured professor, I live in blue state of Georgia, I see you, Michigan. Anyway, so it doesn't all describe those identities. It describes the structural forces of power and their intersection that create the effects that I feel as a result of those identities that I inhabit. So it describes sort of the larger forces, the root cause that produce the effects that I experience. So that's really the key distinction. And it's the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in particular that have really shifted the conversation from questions of identity to questions of power. And so this really is sort of where all the ideas of our book start to come together. Catherine, can you do the next slide? Sweet. Okay. So in short, intersectional feminism, which really provides us the underlying framework for our book, it's not only about issues of women, it's not only about issues of gender, it's about power. It's about who has power and who doesn't. And in today's world, I think many of us would agree, in many ways, that's the reason why we're here today. Data is power, right? You see this in the phrase, data is the new oil, the phrase and the idea of it. And you also see it in the realization that data is just another manifestation of the same old oppression. And so intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, can really help that power be challenged and changed. So our argument in a nutshell is that data science really needs feminism, and actually intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to overturn these power imbalances that we encounter.
So as Lauren and I wrote the book, we asked ourselves sort of what have we learned from our own work in feminist scholarship, our participation in various communities. We also did a kind of scan of various disciplines, particularly disciplines, you know, one of the, I think, wonderful things about feminism is it's across many different disciplines, both qualitative and quantitative. And so we looked in particular at some of the more quantitative disciplines that have operationalized feminism in various ways. Things like GIS and cartography, human-computer interaction, design fields. But then we also looked at, how it's been more used in activism and so on and so forth. And we came up with these 7 principles that for us encapsulate the most important aspects of intersectional feminism as they relate to data. And so this is also how the book is organized. So each of these principles is a chapter in the book. And so what we try to do is introduce readers to some of the feminist theorists and thinkers and activists and ideas behind that principle, as well as introduce readers to people who are working with data that are sort of following that principle, that are sort of already enacting that principle through their work in data science, data collection, data art, and as we'll talk about a little bit later, we have a kind of very expanded idea of what data science consists of. And so the goal here was to operationalize feminism for data science. So really to think about kind of providing a conceptual model that can guide the work of people who are doing work with data, or people who want to in the future work with data, or people who want to refuse to work with data for various reasons. And increasingly, as we see these new sort of applications of technologies jumping forward, falling forward into making profit at the expense of sort of disparate harms, especially on vulnerable and minoritized groups of people, refusal is an increasingly important sort of category of things. And you all actually at University of Michigan have wonderful scholars already working on these things. So like Patricia Garcia in particular, who we recently worked with on an event. So really thinking through, like, what does it mean to refuse certain technologies, and how is that generative? So we don't have time to go through all of these principles, but I think the one thing I want to call your attention to here is that the first 2 chapters have to do with power, examine power and challenge power. And this is because this sort of analysis and also action around changing the balance of power is so central to the feminist project. So we often get asked the question, you know, like, what makes us feminist versus just being good data science or something like that? And this is the answer. The answer is that a consideration of structural intersectional forces of power is at the heart of the feminist project. And that's why we spend, you know, a good amount of the book talking about power, basically. All right, so from here, maybe I'll pass to Lauren. We're going to show you a couple of examples from the book and talk about how they embody these different principles of data feminism.
Sure. So here is an example that we talk about that has to do very much with power. This is one of the first examples that we talk about in the book. It's a project by the artist and educator Mimi Onuoha. It's called the Library of Missing Datasets. So missing datasets is a term coined by Onuoha in order to describe datasets that a reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need. But because of various reasons, and we'll talk about various reasons more specifically in a minute, they don't actually exist in real life. So a data set, and you can read them right here. Trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, people excluded from public housing because of criminal records, or an example that is not here, but is very much of the moment, a gender and race breakdown of the number of people with COVID in the United States. We just don't know. So Onuoha exhibits the library missing 2 ways. One, There's a really beautiful artist statement that is attached that I would encourage everyone to read. And then there's also a physical artwork, and that's the file cabinet that you see on the left. So the file folders are labeled with the title of each of the missing data sets, and then you go to sort of tab through them. You would find one that looks interesting to you and you go to open the folder, but it's empty. It's empty because the data set is missing. And Onuoha's point is that they're empty for a reason, right? Because of some combination of personal will, social or political will, governmental will, or, again, sort of some combination of all of these. And these are what we're talking about when we're talking about forces of power, the underlying, the root cause, why certain project issues, projects and issues receive attention and certain ones do not. And the first step involved in any project that sort of wants to take data feminism as its guidance is examining these forces of power that determine what data are collected and what are not, and what research is undertaken and what research is not. And once we understand how these forces of power operate, how they determine sort of what our data sets consist of and what we even have data about, we can start to take steps to rebalancing these forces of power and begin to affect the change that we want to see in the world. Okay, Catherine.
So building on this idea of missing data and thinking even just of data collection as a political act, we also profile in the book when we're talking about this idea of challenging power. How do we use data science to push back against these unequal power structures? We talk about the story of Maria Salguero, who she is also addressing a problem of missing data. And missing data in this case has to do with the phenomenon of feminicide in Mexico. So some of you may have been following this hashtag Ni Una Menos. This is a real focus of the Latin American feminist movement right now, who's been able to do some extremely impressive things like passing laws in most Latin American countries about criminalizing feminicide, which is gender-based killing of women and girls, and includes cis and trans women. And so feminicide, they are defined as crimes, like there is emerging legislation on the topic. But what happens in Mexico, as in basically every other country in the entire world, the state does not systematically collect data on feminicide. So they actually don't know the scope and the scale of the problem. And they also aren't taking steps beyond the symbolic steps of legislation to actually train people to recognize it and log it in an appropriate way so that they can do something about it. So frustrated by this lack of action on the matter, Maria Salguero started collecting her own data set. So she's now been collecting for almost 5 years, and she has single-handedly, as one person, compiled the largest archive of feminicide in Mexico. And she does this by logging feminicide from news media reports, which, so she's said how she spends 2 to 4 hours a day logging those feminicides and putting them on the map, which you can see here. And she has a sort of various systems for categorizing and classifying them. So she has helped families locate loved ones. She's provided data to journalists and NGOs, and she's testified in front of Mexico's Congress multiple times about this. And so in the book, we talk about this along with other examples, and as a form of what you might call feminist counter data. So this is activist data collection that steps in when the state and our other counting institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And so this idea of counter data collection represents one way to use data to challenge power. And this is, as Lauren mentioned earlier, counter data is everywhere once we start looking for it. And it's actually one of the more exciting spaces, I think, of data journalism, for example. We see this in both sort of citizen and activist practices, but we also see this happening a lot these days in data journalism. And so For example, our most reliable data right now in the US about COVID is not coming from the government. It's coming from news organizations like the New York Times, which is devoting a lot of resources to trying to track every single COVID case. In conjunction with this other sort of coalition, the COVID Tracking Project, which is also primarily made up of news and media organizations. And then we have other folks in this space like Data for Black Lives, Rudolph Reiser's report about COVID-19 in Indian country, which are sort of auditing the data sets and the states that are making data available and saying, hey, like basically pointing out who is releasing data by race and ethnicity and who is not. And just to note that sex and gender are still missing from all these efforts, even though we know that there are these sex and gendered effects of COVID-19, which is to say that it's killing men disproportionately from women. So this idea of counter data collection, once you start kind of with that frame, you can start to see that happening in many places. Back to you, Lauren.
So in the book, we talk about a lot of counter data collection efforts, but not always focusing on the data collection aspect, also focusing on certain other aspects of the project. And this is one that we talk about with respect to the principle of embracing pluralism. And so this is a project undertaken by San Francisco's Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. And since 2013, they go as the AEMP. They've worked in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and community groups in order to collect and map data about the eviction crisis in the Bay Area. And I think that, in 2013, with the infusion of all the tech money into the Bay Area, eviction was an issue that really was disproportionately affecting that part of the country. But now, again, with COVID, I think I read a statistic that something like 20% of all renters in the United States will face eviction by the end of 2020. I mean, this is an issue that is systemic and pervasive and, really, really important to consider. So what you're looking at is a map. And at least on the left, and those red dots that you see indicate a place where a person or a family was evicted. And the blue dots indicate a place where the AEMP has also interviewed one of the people from the household that was evicted. And if you click on the little blue dot, it brings up a video interview with a person, which is what you see on the right. That happens to be a resident of Midtown in San Francisco named Phyllis Bowie. Can you do the next slide, Catherine?
Sorry, there's like a lag from when I click it and then it takes.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, no, I have three different. My daughter is doing online school. My partner is doing online teaching, and here I am, and our internet cannot handle it.
Well, wait, what's the 3-year-old doing right
now? Who knows? Probably creating chaos. So in the book, we contrast the AEMP with the work of the Eviction Lab, which actually may be familiar to many of you because I feel like this project gets a lot of play in academic data science circles. So this is based at Princeton University. It's Matthew Desmond and the sociology department there. And what the goal of the Eviction Lab is to present a national picture of the eviction crisis. And I should say sort of at the outset, this is an incredibly worthy goal. It's a really valuable project. I teach a whole bunch of Desmond's papers in my classes, but it's really important to recognize how different it is in terms of process from the AEMP, right? So if you look at this map, you think, okay, I'm getting a comprehensive picture of the United States. Like there it is, there's a map of the country. Certainly they're working with bigger data, right? There is more of it. But one of the things that the AEMP has really helpfully shown is that these national real estate databases, like the ones that the Eviction Lab uses, significantly undercount evictions. And you can think about just for a minute sort of why this might be true. For one, the real estate industry is not invested in counting any more evictions than they have to, right? That's bad for business if it seems like they're evicting too many people. And then the other thing you can think about is sort of the ways in which you can be evicted that don't actually count as a legal, someone serving you with paperwork evictions, which range from your landlord not fixing your appliances, so your apartment becomes uninhabitable and you need to leave, you know, lurking in your lobby, threatening you, raising your rent a lot. You know, all of these methods are ways to get you out of your apartment. I think this is something that students can sympathize with a lot, but they don't count as official evictions. But because AEMP works with tenants' rights organizations, so the organizations in communities where people go when they say, hey, this is happening to me, you know, my landlord hasn't fixed my stove or my bathroom for a month, I gotta leave. They've gathered actually admittedly messier, but much more comprehensive and more contextualized data about the full extent of the problem of eviction in the Bay Area. And so in the book, we talk about this in terms of what is gained by embracing pluralism. What you gain is more context, sort of a fuller extent of the picture at hand. And how you get it is by talking to people who are impacted by the issue that you are seeking to study.
So this often begs the question, so this idea of embracing pluralism means like bringing many voices to the table and thinking about how a knowledge process necessarily, you know, a feminist idea around strengthening objectivity would be about pooling our knowledge and bringing multiple diverse perspectives to the table. But then this begs the question of like, so, okay, we're bringing people's perspectives to the table, we're including people. We can't bring everybody's, like not everybody can come to that table. So whose voices do we prioritize? And feminism is very specific about this. It's not just who's convenient or who shows up, because often those are going to be the people with the most power, the most free time, or the most, et cetera, most privilege. So following the work of Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, Xiaowen Barzell in Human Computer Interaction, a feminist design perspective takes power into account in thinking about who should be present and who should be centered in any data and or design process. And it centers the people at the edges and the margins first and foremost to make decisions from the outside in. So this is sort of a like hypothetical histogram here of maybe like who you might design for in a given design process. And so like a lot of design processes are like, okay, we're gonna design for these folks in the middle. There's like a bunch of these folks in the middle. We'll go out and we'll talk to them, see what their needs are, see what they want us to do, and go by that. But in fact, feminist design would start inversely. So feminist design would prioritize the participation of people who have been most marginalized and the people who are hardest to reach and the people who we don't tend, if we are in positions of power, to have deep and authentic relationships with. It would tell us to go and start to build those relationships. And here we're also drawing off the work of the Design Justice Network. So for any of those who thinking about these questions of participation and especially in participation in data science and machine learning and algorithm design, they're a great sort of community to be a part of. They have a design principle that's very resonant with this, and they say, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. And so those are the folks that we should be working hard to build relationships with. Okay, next to you, Lauren.
Great. So we just have one more example. Oh, and I should just say, you know, the slide that Catherine said before, it doesn't just apply to design processes, but it also just applies to statistical methods and how we analyze them, right? You know, so thinking about so many models are built to converge, are built to sort of cluster, you know, sort of bring people together and then focus on the sort of centers of those things. And so the same principle would apply, right? So looking at your, looking at the output, pay attention to outliers, pay attention to people who don't fit in the categories. These are the issues and people and ideas that feminist design sort of tells you to center. But with that said, you know, what I want to do with this last example is shift the frame a little bit from focusing on the issue of power and people, right? So like people who have power and people who don't, to think a little bit more about structures of power, and more specifically, these binary structures of power that are defined by a hard distinction between two groups. So feminist theory has helped to show how these binary distinctions are usually hiding a hierarchy. with one group on top and the other on the bottom. And then once you see the hierarchy, you start to understand why that hard line between the two groups exists. It's there to ensure that one group stays on the top, maintains control of their power, and the other is relegated to the bottom. And so, the distinction between the idea of man and the idea of woman is really the obvious and most enduring reference point here, because it's a clear example both of a false binary and an unequal hierarchy, right? There are more than two genders, and among them, no gender is any essentially better than any of the others. But one of the key moves of feminist theorists, to go back to talking sort of these ideas in circulation associated with feminism, is to take the critique of the gender binary and use the same conceptual model to question other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world. So you could think of the distinction between nature and culture. Why is there such a hard line between these things? The distinction between subject and object. This comes up a lot in research and ethnography and anthropology and things like this. Or the binary that I want to talk about right now, which is the artificial distinction between reason and emotion. So in an Anglo-Western context, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we see this play out in data and data visualization all the time. So if you want to focus on data visualization, just for visual appeal, you can think, best practices, what do they involve? It's like clean design, a minimal aesthetic, presenting just the facts, don't sway the viewer, things like this. But the question remains, why are these our best practices, especially when scientific research has shown that we interpret these aesthetic choices just as emotionally. We tend to believe these charts are more truthful than they actually are. So I just want to talk a little bit more about visualizations that do the opposite, visualizations that deliberately leverage emotion. So the large black image that you've been staring at is actually a screenshot of an animated visualization, and it's of the number of gun-related deaths in the United States, in this case in the year 2013. But actually it's since been updated since we took the screenshot. So each of the people killed by a gun in that year is represented as a single arc. That's what you see in the small black image. And the arcs are traced one by one onto the screen, and they start out slow so you can read the accompanying data with each person, and then they get faster and faster and start to overlap and overlap until they create the sort of semicircular web. That's what you see in the larger image. And if you watch it, you should Google it and watch it now. It's the design firm is Periscopic, and it's just called US Gun Deaths. And as you watch it, it becomes almost overwhelming. And that's kind of the point of it. There are too many people being killed by guns in the United States, right? There's too many to visualize, there's too many to watch because there are too many people dying. It's an epidemic. Now, the interesting thing is that methodologically, it's no less statistically sound than any other study, right? So the data from the people derived from crimes.gov. This is a website that exists, National Crime Dataset. Their projected lifespans are determined using a model from the World Health Organization, which takes a lot of race, gender, region information into account. And they write about this. They publish this on the page, but nevertheless, this visualization was viewed with immense suspicion when it was released because it made us feel things. And a feminist approach here would say, that's not a problem at all that it made us feel things. And in fact, it's a more compelling visualization precisely because it blends reason with emotion. And so once you begin to allow yourself to rebalance emotion and reason, you really get sort of a much wider and more capacious data communication toolbox, which then in turn allows you to focus me, on what really matters. So it's honoring the context of the data, listening to lived experience, and then trying to take action to challenge these imbalances of power that we encounter in the world.
So if it isn't already apparent, one of the things we try to make clear in the book is that these principles of data feminism apply to every stage of a data science project. So it's not only in the data collection and missing data, it's in sort of that whole pipeline of a data science project. And so this idea of like, so when do we do something feminist? And actually this goes back to an insight that Lauren and I sort of backed into from our own work. Like the first paper that we wrote together was called Feminist Data Visualization, because we came together around shared interests in visualization. And we somewhat quickly realized that like the visualization, you know, is like the kind of like an end point. I mean, it can be a during point as well, but it's sort of an end point of a process. And so, you know, if you're working with things downstream that are so incredibly flawed, it's really hard to go back in that process and like sort of re-engineer them for equity. And so when do you make data science feminist is basically thinking about the question, when do we think about questions of power in data science? And the answer is everywhere, all the time and everywhere. And so everything from funding and leadership, taking a close look at how much funding there even is for the type of work you want to pursue, who's leading the project, down to who's asking the research questions, how are we doing the data collection, processing, cleaning, et cetera, et cetera. And so like this is a everywhere and all the time normative framework. And this brings us to our very final point that we want to make before the Q&A, which is probably obvious from the examples that we've been showing, but I think it's important to restate, is that data feminism really insists on an expanded definition of data science. So our data science, the kind that we describe in the book, is not defined by the size of the data set. It's not defined by the credentials of the people who are undertaking the work. These are things that are continually used to exclude women and to exclude people of color from the field, as well as to exclude work whose contribution is socio-technical rather than purely technical. So if we expand our definition of data science, then we can see really clearly that some of the most exciting work in data science today is being undertaken by artists, by journalists, by humanists, by community organizers, activists, librarians are doing some amazing things. And a lot of this doesn't look like traditional data science and like white papers and things like that. So here, for example, we do have one example of that kind of work, a more traditional work. Here on the left, we have Margaret Mitchell and her team that is working on bias in natural language processing techniques, for example. But then next to Margaret's work, we have an interactive artificial intelligence powered sculpture by the artist Stephanie Jenkins. And so this is a sculpture you can actually go talk to. And it's an AI, like a kind of, like a Siri Alexa type of verbal AI that you interact with. But the training data set for the AI, it was trained on a small data set of only Stephanie Jenkins' member, 3 generations of Black family members and women, all of them. So the sort of bot answers you from being trained within this very kind of particular cultural familial circumstances. And then on the right is the Pudding's inventive and fun data journalism, which examines gender bias in Hollywood screenplays. And then on the bottom is work by the group called Data Therapy, where they do data literacy trainings with community-based organizations and nonprofits. And then they use that as a process to then create a data mural in those communities. So this represents work that was with a community gardening and youth program in the city of Somerville, and then they installed their collaboratively designed data mural, basically like a large public infographic, in one of the community organizations' community gardens. So we have hundreds of examples that are like this in the book, which we selected to illustrate our points and inspire people to action. Because one of the things that we recognize is that data is definitely at the root of so many problems, but at the same time, it can also be part of the solution. But to do that, again, we have to expand who counts, who we consider as data scientists, and what work we value as part of this field, especially if we truly aspire to have data science do good in the world.
So we wanted to end with some concrete things that you can do in order to do this kind of work, to sort of be the change. And some of the things that you can do are to do work that interrogates and exposes racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression. examine how these forces show up in data and the world. You can collect counter data and missing data. You can introduce new communities to data science, and you can use data to advocate for equity at your institution, especially educational institutions. This one is huge. You can experiment with creative forms of data presentation and communication, including some of the ones that you've seen in our presentation. So sculptures, murals, but also VR, fashion shows, quilts, things like this. Include more people in data-driven projects, especially impacted communities. This is not just sort of at the end, but at the beginning as essential parts of the project and its shape. And then make sure you credit your sources and your research support staff. Make your process transparent and reflect on your own identity. So I think that's it for now. We have a couple of questions, time for questions, and I'm going to open this Q&A box. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you. That was great. I'm going to give Angela just a minute to pull some of the questions together. One that appeared in chat early on, let's start there, that Vicky asked, corporate white influence in Silicon Valley creating algorithms with bias, and that's terrifying. What can the government do to control that trend?
Yeah, I think a lot. So, and we are seeing, I think, the emergence of like really interesting policy responses, I guess. So I think, like, first and foremost, I think one of the cases that's interesting to trace is facial recognition. So if you follow the work of the Algorithmic Justice League, for example, they've been really big in organizing folks and trying to get facial recognition bans passed. And they have been passed actually at the municipal level in several different cities. And so this is specifically looking at banning that technology, which would which we know is very biased against women, and also in particular against women of color. And in fact, there was a really big New York Times report about how facial recognition technology misidentified a man and actually got him arrested, which is sort of terrifying. And so I think, like, those are really interesting. And I think, like, in particular, one of the things, or this is my opinion, and I'm not a policy person, but I think one of the more exciting policy responses are these moratoriums that are getting passed, where it's like, it's not an outright forever ban on something, but it's a stay on using it for any kind of, especially in law enforcement, but for any kind of particular thing, until we show that it doesn't have disparate impacts. So, like, right now, what we have is we have the burden of proof is on impacted people to demonstrate disparate impacts. And so the burden of proof we need to actually shift. That needs to be the work of companies that are making these kinds of social sorting technologies where humans get differential opportunities. And so we need to shift that burden of proof. And I think the moratoriums are one way of doing that. So to get more time, push the onus back on the corporations, they go like fund some actual like nonpartisan studies or whatever, and then we can maybe have a conversation from there. But I think there is increasing public, or I have noted even just since the time we were writing the book, I really feel like there's increasing public engagement in these issues. Like just that example that Lauren showed at the beginning, where they're like, people are demonstrating outside with signs that say "fuck the algorithm" now. Like I feel like we wouldn't have seen that maybe 5 years ago or something. Yeah, Lauren, what do you?
I'll just add to that I feel like, you know, this is two points. One is that the people doing the work to expose the bias in these algorithms, this is work that like you can do. I feel like I'm like I'll do my thumbs. You can do. I learned that from our elected officials. No, but seriously, the work is both bottom up and top down. It's both qualitative and quantitative. So the facial recognition example, this came out of a technical audit of 4 facial recognition, sort of 4 off-the-shelf sets of facial recognition software. You can look at it. It was, you know, the project, it was done by someone who was a graduate student at the time. It's sort of like within all of our hands. It was coupled with contextual qualitative information about how facial recognition software is used. And those 2 points together was what led to those moratoriums. And then I also, from the top, you know, as governments are encountering algorithms that repeat these patterns, right, of gender bias, of racial bias, economic class-based bias, right? We're seeing more policies, like in Canada, you are now required in certain parts of the government to receive funding to complete a gender equity analysis, where you need to think about how your project will impact different genders, if it will have equitable impact. And that is required by the government to receive funding. The GDPR, I think, in a vaguer but nevertheless sort of top-down way, says like you need to think about privacy. What data are you soliciting from people? How will this be used? And we're starting to see in the US, although none of this has really achieved the level of legislation, but individual Congress people are starting to think about data and policy for regulating and regulating data and directing data-directed research in specific ways. So that's just what I'll add to that.
Thank you. I see it's 10:01, so I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll see where we are. I'm going to combine two questions that come in the Q&A about global and transnational data feminism and how you actually bring this into practice. So as we head into this symposium about practice, what would you say about how to incorporate data feminism into our work, especially attending to global and transnational feminism and the potential for silencing?
Thank you. Whoever asked that, thank you so much for that question. We're very specific in the book that we try to be very specific about kind of our own positionality and our own sort of area of expertise. And we write for sure from a US position, and we try to make that pretty clear. But that said, I think we're both really excited to see what potential connections there are, and are already starting to see people picking it up in different sort of transnational contexts. In particular, there's been really an outpouring of interest from Latin America, which is maybe because just again, the Latin American feminist movement is so strong right now. So I from my perspective, like we were not writing to be globally inclusive, I guess I would say. And I think feminism looks very, very different in these international contexts. And so I think one of the things we would love to be in dialogue about with folks who are outside of the US around which parts resonate and then which parts don't, or which principles are not yet present in an adequate way for thinking about doing data science in a global context, or in a like sort of very specific and situated context outside of the US. So maybe, I don't know, Lauren, you want to take that too before we go into the practice question?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, just one thing that I'll add, I mean, plus one to everything that Catherine said. I mean, just to give sort of another example, we see a lot of thinking about this, not from a feminist perspective, but sort of in general about questions of positionality in, I would say, like development economics. And you see, I think, better work being done to incorporate, like if you as a US-based academic researcher go to a different country to do some research, incorporating people who live there, are from there, know that area into the project team, sort of like the training up of project members. And that's great and definitely should be continued. A feminist approach, I think, would take this even further and say, before you even figure out what the research is that you're doing, involve local impacted communities in the project from the very beginning. If you can think back to that graphic that we had a couple of slides ago, really reassess what expertise it is that you are bringing to the table, and open yourself up to the expertise that other people in other countries and other regions might have, that sort of might take a little bit more work in order to integrate into sort of the academic research pipeline, and be intentional about that, and be open to it taking you in new directions that you might not have foreseen.
Yeah, and in regards to practice, I guess I would just say, like, I think there's a lot of work to be done there. What we outline in the book are, in a way, it's a more generalized framework, and then a lot of sort of specific examples. But then I would say there are, if folks are looking for more like pragmatic, like checklists and things like that, the book doesn't offer that, or we don't have that yet. But I think we've been starting to see folks sort of starting to do that work. And so, like, for example, there was just a wonderful team of students led by their professor at a hackathon that they took up the challenge of the Consider Context chapter, which is chapter 6, and they sort of like audited the metadata of different data sets and evaluated how much context they provide, what are the risks and harms of using these data sets that are unstated, for example. And so it's been just really gratifying to us to see how the kind of more generalized framework is picked up and really like actualized in these ways that we couldn't have ever imagined. And so I think that I would say thinking of these as more as general principles, but then also borrowing from some of the specifics of the examples, because like these people, there's people out there who are already doing this work and sort of following in their methodological footsteps.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic. And I will copy the Q&A so that you can see them in the networking session, which comes up today at 11:50. So right now we have a quick break and then come back to this same Zoom session at 10:10 for research talks. And I want to give a thank you to Erwig for co-sponsoring this keynote. Thank you both so much for setting the tone for our symposium. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation and good luck. And we'll see you all at 11:50.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for listening.
Bye.